Dive Podcast, straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. With Robert Johnson and Linda Miller, we cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed. Hello and welcome. If you're looking to get a handle on the recent developments around the conflict in Ukraine, you're in the right place.
We've been sifting through several reports, lots of communication happening.
Exactly. And today, we're focusing on piecing together those communications involving the U.S. President Trump, Russian President Putin, other leaders too.
The aim is really just to lay out a clear narrative of the recent diplomacy and what positions have been stated.
Okay, so where should we kick off? That Trump-Putin phone call seems pretty central.
Definitely. That was the evening of May 19th, and apparently it was their third call since U.S. President Trump returned to the White House.
Yeah, the topics. Ukraine and the relationship between the U.S. and Russia.
That's right. The conflict, bilateral relations, pretty standard agenda items, you'd think, but the context is key.
Because this came just after those direct talks in Istanbul, right? The first in years.
Exactly. May 16th in Istanbul. So things were already, let's say, in motion diplomatically when this call happened.
Okay, now here's a really significant piece we've seen reported. After that call with Russian President Putin.
Yes.
U.S. President Trump apparently told European leaders he was convinced Russia would win the conflict.
Wow. Okay. That's quite a statement to relay. And around the same time, Russian President Putin was saying Moscow has, enough strength and resources to finish what they started in 2022.
So you have these two sort of parallel assertions happening. What do you think the impact of the U.S. president's reported view might be on European allies?
Well, it's a critical point, isn't it? If key allies hear that the U.S. anticipates a Russian victory, well, it could certainly affect their long-term thinking on aid, on sanctions, on their whole approach.
It suggests maybe a different assessment of the likely endgame.
Potentially, or at least a willingness by the U.S. president to voice that assessment quite directly to allies.
And this wasn't just a one-off call. U.S. President Trump also spoke with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky.
Before and after the Putin call, is that right?
That's the report, yes. And then he briefed a whole host of European leaders.
Like who?
Let's see. French President Macron, Finnish President Stubb, Ursula von der Leyen from the European Commission, Italy's Giorgia Meloni, and Friedrich Merz in Germany.
Quite the list. So a real flurry of diplomatic calls.
It really underlines the level of international focus on this, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It suggests U.S. President Trump is, maybe trying to manage the situation or at least keep everyone in the loop from his perspective.
Now, according to reports, the message to President Zelensky and the Europeans was something like, Russia and Ukraine need to find their own way out.
Sort of hands-off, in a way. Find your own solution.
Seems that way. And it also looks like he might be backing away from earlier ideas about joining Europe and, tightening the screws on Russia with more sanctions.
Okay, so that's potentially a shift. Less focus on collective pressure, maybe more on, facilitating direct talks.
Perhaps. A preference for a settlement worked out mainly between Kyiv and Moscow themselves.
It sort of aligns with some things U.S. President Trump has said before, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, descriptions of Russia as a major military power and comments about President Zelensky asking for more and more, but lacking leverage.
Right, I remember that. And saying Zelensky was in a, quote, disadvantageous position from the start.
Exactly. So those past remarks maybe give us some context for how he's approaching it now, a kind of realpolitik view, perhaps?
He's also framed U.S. support as a huge service to Ukraine, suggesting without it they'd be defeated very quickly.
Which, of course, Moscow condemns. Any aid to Kyiv gets a strong reaction from them.
And on the flip side, you have Russian President Putin asserting victory is, quote, inevitable.
Yes, and reiterating their stated goals. Controlling Donbass, eliminating what they call an anti-Russian enclave, demilitarization, denazification, those points keep coming up.
It's crucial to just report those stated aims, understand how Moscow frames it.
Absolutely. They present these as, fundamental security needs from their perspective.
Russian President Putin also said the conflict needs to end by getting rid of the root causes.
Again, reinforcing that they have the means, the resources to achieve their objectives.
But then, interestingly, after talking to U.S. President Trump, he apparently said Russia is ready to work on some kind of memorandum with Ukraine.
A memorandum including a ceasefire?
Yes, but, and it's a big but, conditional on reaching, quote, relevant agreements.
Relevant agreements.
Yeah.
Well, it's pretty vague, isn't it? Could mean almost anything. Territorial issues, security guarantees.
Leaves a lot of room for interpretation.
Yeah,
And probably disagreement.
no doubt. But Russian President Putin did stress finding compromises acceptable to everyone is the best way forward, and he said he supports stopping hostility.
However, he also raised some pointed questions, didn't he? About what happens during a long ceasefire.
Yeah, like would Ukraine keep mobilizing, keep getting foreign weapons, keep training troops?
Which sounds like a direct response to Ukraine previously, saying they needed a long truce before real talks could start.
It does seem like pushback on that idea, highlighting the practical security dilemmas even a ceasefire would create.
And after all this back and forth, U.S. President Trump apparently claimed progress had been made toward a settlement.
Progress. Okay. It's hard to gauge from the outside exactly what that means, but it's his assessment.
Let's shift gears slightly. There's talk about the Vatican potentially getting involved.
Right. Finnish President Alexander Stubb mentioned this. He was one of the leaders U.S. President Trump called.
What did he say?
That technical negotiations for a ceasefire might happen in the Vatican, maybe next week.
Technical negotiations. So, maybe not high-level political talks, but working out the nuts and bolts.
That's how it sounds. Practicalities of implementing a ceasefire, perhaps. The Vatican itself has confirmed it's willing to host talks.
An idea U.S. President Trump had apparently supported earlier. And Pope Leo XIV had also signaled the Vatican's readiness to mediate.
It brings another potential avenue into play. We've seen talks tried in Belarus, then Turkey.
And as we said, Istanbul just recently, May 16th, the first direct talks in 3 years.
So the search for a venue and a format continues. The Vatican offers that sort of historical neutrality.
And that Istanbul meeting, it did yield something concrete, didn't it?
Yes. Reports said they agreed the largest prisoner exchange yet, 1,000 for 1,000.
That's significant.
Very. And also an agreement for both sides to present their ideas, their visions for a ceasefire. Moscow said it was ready to keep talking. Turkey reported a principled agreement for another meeting.
So some tangible steps. Even amidst all the tough rhetoric, the prisoner exchange is a real humanitarian development.
Absolutely. And sharing ceasefire plans, even if the plans themselves are far apart, is at least a procedural step forward.
Okay, let's turn to the U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. There was a moment during a House hearing recently.
Yes, regarding the term war criminal.
Exactly. He was asked directly by Senator Bill Keating if he considers Russian President Putin a war criminal.
And he declined to use the label, right?
He did. His explanation was basically, look, you could call events war crimes, but his main goal right now is ending the war.
And talking to Putin is necessary for that, was his reasoning.
That was the gist. He said, there's no doubt war crimes have happened, but the time and place for assigning responsibility comes later. Right now, the focus is stopping the fighting.
It's a pragmatic stance, you could say, prioritizing diplomacy over potentially inflammatory labels that might shut doors.
It's a clear distinction he's drawing between acknowledging the acts and focusing on the immediate diplomatic task.
And it contrasts with his position back in 2022 when he was a senator.
Right. Back then, he was very vocal about supporting Ukraine and did call Russian President Putin a war criminal.
But now, as Secretary of State, the emphasis is different. He mentioned in February his goal under U.S. President Trump is to ensure peace and end the conflict.
And he emphasized the State Department's role in ending wars, not starting them.
It seems like a shift reflecting the responsibilities of his current role, aligning with the administration's diplomatic objectives, perhaps, maintaining flexibility.
Okay, one last piece of news. Some comments from U.S. President Trump about President Zelensky's trip to South Africa.
Oh, what was said?
He was hosting South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, mentioned he'd called Zelensky and found out he was in South Africa. And he reportedly asked President Ramaphosa, quote, what the hell is he doing in South Africa?
Seriously, and Ramaphosa's response?
Apparently replied, communicating with us. And U.S. President Trump called it a strange case.
Interesting exchange. Maybe suggests a perspective that Ukraine's diplomatic outreach should be focused elsewhere. Or maybe just surprise.
Hard to say for sure, but just for context on that trip, President Zelensky arrived in South Africa on April 24th, had a meeting planned with President Ramaphosa.
But he had to cut it short, didn't he?
Yes, because of strikes back home that night. He returned to Ukraine immediately. There were explosions in Kyiv and Kharkiv.
Tragic. Reports mention significant casualties in Kyiv.
They did. And President Zelensky's immediate reaction was tasking his defense minister to contact partners about strengthening air defenses.
Understandable. Meanwhile, the Russian Ministry of Defense acknowledged strikes, saying they targeted military and energy facilities.
They reported hitting targets related to aviation, missiles, armored vehicles, fuel production, airfields, and troop locations across many areas.
It just starkly highlights the reality, doesn't it? Even as all these calls and potential talks are happening, the conflict on the ground remains incredibly intense.
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.